If I told you to close your eyes and without thinking, act like someone with high amounts of testosterone, how would you act? Would you act like any of the men in the previous clip? Would you flare your traps? Would you talk with an extremely deep voice and say something like,
"Sup, bro? You ready to work out?"
Chances are you would. And depending on a person's view of men and masculinity, they would likely say something much less charitable if asked to act in such a stereotype. Ultimately, what people assume most often about testosterone is that it causes aggression and violence. But here's the thing. This assumption, and nearly all other assumptions the average person has about testosterone, are incorrect. And it's not just the average person with these incorrect views of testosterone, but even entire organizations, and in some cases, organizations that matter. When it comes to the science of testosterone, there are 3 behaviors tightly correlated to this hormone, namely that it seems to correlate with higher sex drive, taking greater risks, and chasing status. However, even though I say this, men and women overlap in even these 3 factors. In a seminal paper written by Stuart Ritchie titled "Sex Differences in the Adult Human Brain," all regions of the male and female human brain overlap much more than they differ. The researchers write, for every brain measure that showed even large sex differences, there was always overlap between males and females, even in the cases of large differences in total brain volume. There was 48% sample overlap. If there's one lesson to take away from this video, let it be this. Most men and women have nearly the exact same brains. So when we talk about differences, we are talking about edge cases. When we talk about extremes, we have to realize that men have the following in spades. Number 1, a will to status. The myth of testosterone and aggression. Right off the bat, let's get one thing clear. Testosterone does not cause aggression or violence. Instead, testosterone motivates us to chase status. If the means to status in a monk monastery is to meditate, every monk injected with high amounts of testosterone would meditate for longer hours. If the means to status at a fundraiser goes to the man who donates the most, you would see much more generous donations. If men in the room were injected with more testosterone, if you're in fashion and the means to status among your peers is being eccentric attire-wise, you're gonna wear the most flamboyant attire. In essence, testosterone is the part of the brain that makes human beings chase success in its immediate environment, regardless of risk. A fictional character I can think of that embodies this factor is Negan from The Walking Dead. Even though I'm talking about him from a strictly analogous standpoint, I am obviously not advocating to venerate or emulate the guy. The dude was obviously antisocial at certain points. If you've watched The Walking Dead, you would know that the writers did an incredible job at making us viewers feel like survival was nearly impossible. And even though a zombie apocalypse is incredibly unrealistic and unlikely, we still felt at some point helpless for every one of its members in the show, especially in the season 6 finale when we saw Negan for the first time. The first thing to note about testosterone, according to Robert Sapolsky in his book Determined, the role of testosterone rarely generates new patterns of aggression. Instead, it makes pre-existing patterns more likely to happen. Though Negan was slightly squeamish, he was already aggressive before the apocalypse. In fact, before the zombie outbreak, he went to jail for nearly killing someone at a bar. And in a world where aggression, cunning, and coalition is literally a requirement to survive, Negan was highly attuned to the means of status in a genuinely cutthroat environment. Recall that Negan also loved teaching kids. He was a gym teacher, and after the world ended, he venerated Carl for his valor and even sacrificed his life and almost died for Judith. Another thing to note about testosterone. According to an immensely influential paper written by John Winfield titled The Challenge Hypothesis, when an organism is challenged for status, testosterone amplifies behaviors that are needed to maintain status. When we first saw Negan, He was the pinnacle of high status because he was a sociopath, ruthless, and extremely disagreeable. However, in season 9, he completely changes course and decides to be tender to Judith, to be submissive to Michonne, self-sacrificial, and useful to the group. He even infiltrates enemy lines, reaches peak social status by killing their leader, becomes the new leader, and returns to Alexandria, all to increase social status within the group. The incredibly nuanced thing about testosterone, then, is not that it causes aggression, but that testosterone picks up cues from the environment and orients the organism to excel in its immediate external space. This is why the argument that being a man is a social construct might have some validity. And if that's true, then it also might be the case why men are more adaptable and dominant in nearly all social and cultural milieus. It's why men become more aggressive or even more submissive in prison, why abused boys become worse perpetrators or worse victims of abuse later in life, and why Negan was able to survive so successfully during the original Walking Dead series, namely because of the fact that testosterone makes pre-existing patterns more likely to happen while at the same time amplifies behaviors needed to maintain status. High amounts of testosterone also lends itself to another extreme: high sex drive, libido. As we just saw, testosterone is not an indicator of aggression, but rather of attaining status. And the behaviors that led to social status differ by environment and cultures. But with sexuality, however, not so much. In another influential paper written by Richard Lippa, and one of the largest studies of its kind, the wide gap of men's and women's libido does not vary much by country, even when taking into account more sexually active societies and gender equitable countries like Sweden, Denmark, and France. This leads many sociologists to believe that libido is not a consequence of social construct or culture. This paper and many others are just a tip of the iceberg of evidence in proving the large differences in male and female libido. But why? What's the reason for this large difference in sex drive? Well, if we take social status and sex drive as variables and put them into one equation, we come to one obvious conclusion: offspring. Testosterone is like TARS from Interstellar. It can call for aggression when needed, is slightly programmable by its environment, but most interesting of all, can, for the lack of a better word, sacrifice itself once its job is completed. Recall that TARS detached from the Endurance once the mission was completed to save Professor Brand. Well, testosterone has almost the same effect, except instead of sacrificing itself to save humanity, which it's technically also for, testosterone dramatically decreases its presence once a child is born. Kinda. Essentially, testosterone and its powerful effects on the male sex drive is for the sake of having, but not maintaining relationships with their offspring. Researchers studied two separate cultures in Tanzania, one monogamous, the Hadza, the other polygynous, the Datoga. Interestingly, the Datoga fathers hardly had a difference in testosterone levels when compared to the men who had no children. Why? Because they did not spend time with their offspring. Now, compared to the monogamous Hadza fathers, T levels dropped almost 50% compared to the Hadza fathers who had no children. Researchers believe the reason for this is due to the fact that the Hadza physically interact with their children, playing, carrying, feeding, or teaching. By the way, I hope you can see that I'm not advocating for abandoning your child for something as superficial as testosterone. Instead, more than anything else in this entire video, I want to state how universal some behaviors can be. Testosterone is an incredibly powerful hormone, but it seems what's even more powerful is our drive for offspring and status. In fact, these two drives are so strong that it can even drive us men to do incredibly dangerous things at the expense of our own well-being, meaning that testosterone lowers the male threshold for risk. Men are much less risk-averse than women, and if you mix in the fact that men are more status-seeking and have higher libido, you might think that this could be the cause for criminality, sexual assault, gambling, etc. While testosterone, culture, and childhood could be to blame for these things, you could possibly overlook the fact that testosterone might actually be the cause for positive risk and status-seeking behaviors. For example, more than 100 years ago, the Carnegie Hero Fund began recognizing and supporting men and women who perform acts of heroism in civilian life. And you can actually go online at carnegiehero.org to see countless acts of selfless courage people have made, dating all the way back to the early 1900s. An example is one Robert H. Canfield in 1907 who saved 3 women from drowning but died trying to save 2 more. Or Jennifer Lynn Dixon, who saved a man from burning to death. If you look through this incredibly inspiring PDF, you would notice that most of these heroes were men. In a paper published by the University of Hawaii, researchers looked at the entire roll of honor over a 6-year period and found that a staggering 92% of courageous acts were done by men. It's also worth mentioning that historically, 20% of Carnegie Award recipients have died trying to save others. This 20% also goes for the Medal of Honor, which also honors acts of heroism but for men and women in the military. Most of these recipients are consistently men. And you might say, well, it's because the military serves men more than women. But I'm sure it's almost safe to say that these men knew the risks they were getting into and still decided to wager their life for a cause, even at the risk of death. But where does this come from? And what's the cause for this drive for risk? Well, it seems science has found the answer, and it might shock you. Offspring. Again. Risk tolerance is not a social construct. In fact, it's as biological as libido. This is because almost all throughout human history, our male ancestors reproduced far less than women, which sounds weird when you hear it at first, but essentially, only a few men impregnated multiple women while most men didn't reproduce at all. Think of Peter Fletcher, who you've never heard of because he died with low status and no kids, versus Genghis Khan, who's the ancestor of almost 16 million people today due to having fathered so many children. It's because of Genghis Khan having so many kids and this Peter Fletcher guy having none that risk was such a breakthrough to the human condition. If he was alive during Genghis's time, Peter's only chance at having children or attaining status was to do something incredibly ballsy despite physical or reputational harm, sacrificing his life to save someone else's, taking down a lion or an entire army by himself, challenging Genghis Khan to a one-on-one, etc. The reason for this is because the more risk we perceive someone went through, the more our attention gets drawn to the man who is risking everything, especially if the reward outweighs the risk. And across all cultures, it seems that men are more willing than women to risk everything for some greater reward. Again, of all the human androgens, testosterone is the most potent. In fact, it's so potent that all the differences you see between the male and female body are due to this single androgen. The initial genetic plan for all humans is to be female by default, and this isn't even strictly true for humans but for all mammals on the planet. However, for humans, the Y in the XY chromosome is programmed to get the testes growing, and once the testes are developed, male embryos and their brains are completely transformed and doused in testosterone. A surge of the hormone pumps through the body, suppressing its default female reproductive body parts, and a whole host of other masculinizing features are initiated until finally the second and final surge. And can you guess that final surge of testosterone? Puberty. And in puberty, everything changes. I say all these things because I feel like we all need to enter a kind of societal puberty on our views of testosterone. Society would be more developed if we just embraced all the beautiful things it has to offer instead of incorrectly associating it with rampant violence, aggression, or even hyper-masculine behaviors. Obviously, the message for this video wasn't to advocate for being immoderate or irresponsible about these three behaviors, but I think if we can just be smart about capitalizing on our biology, it's possible we can live with a greater understanding of our male superpowers and live a more purposeful life. A life not just aligned with compassion for others, but a life of striving to be the most formidable version of ourselves in any social milieu. A life of passion and love, and more than anything, a life of sheer adventure in the face of any and all dangers. So to all the men out there who aren't sure about the true role of testosterone, just remember, in you is a tremendously beautiful and misunderstood hormone which helps you live with virility, love passionately, and live formidably.